I want to welcome everybody back to another episode of the Empower Grief Journey podcast. I'm your host, Chris Mamoni, and I'm an acceptance coach that helps people heal from grief, loss, and trauma to discover their self-acceptance and step into their personal power. This podcast is your dedicated space for healing, growth, and transformation. Each episode shares insightful and inspirational stories along with practical tools and actionable insights that can help guide you along the healing journey. Today, I have an awesome guest with us. You guys are really going to like her. We have Reverend Christine Vaughan Davies. She runs the hospital chaplaincy department at Robert Wood Johnson University Hospital. She is an ordained Presbyterian minister, a seminary professor, and trained spiritual director. Christine shares her stories from her chaplaincy work to normalize grief and help people live more fully in the moment while educating about grief and loss and advanced care planning. She lives with her family on a small farm in New Jersey, spending her time chasing chickens and chauffeuring her children to their activities. Christine, welcome to the podcast.
Thanks so much for having me here. I'm delighted that you're making these episodes and really sharing your story and the importance of grief work with the world.
Well, I appreciate that. I've learned on my own grief journey that grief is something that we do not talk about very often, and it's
Mhm.
something that people push under the carpet and try to avoid feeling and try to avoid experiencing it. And that's really when grief takes over in its fullest form, and it changes us in a lot of ways from
Mhm.
a surface level to a deep level. Um,
Absolutely.
so, so I wanted to give you some time to share with listeners a little bit more about what you do, and a little bit more about yourself.
Yeah. Well, thank you for the bio. That certainly is exhaustive. I'll share because not everyone knows what a chaplain is or chaplaincy director or a spiritual director. So my day job is I work in a hospital and I run the chaplaincy department, which a hospital chaplain is someone who is trained to be with patients and families and staff and essentially offering an extra layer of emotional and spiritual support. Much of what we are involved in is around end of life and bereavement. Bereavement, that's probably about 80% of the work that we do. But some of it is just routine work as well with patients or their families or staff, because hospitalizations can bring up all sorts of emotions with them. And so we want to give people a space to listen and to be heard. And then there's times where we may also need to be advocates for how they are incorporating their spirituality or their religious practices while they are inpatient in the hospital. So that's what I do my day job. And then on the side, I have a individual supervision and spiritual direction practice. So a spiritual director is someone who journeys with people who are trying to either deepen their spiritual practices or maybe they have some grief or some questions about what they believe or wanting to feel God's presence or the divine presence more fully. I used to be a therapist. It's a little bit like therapy and a little bit like meeting with a chaplain, so it's kind of in between. And I usually meet with people about once a month and we listen to what the divine might be doing in their lives. And so there's more about spiritual direction if people are interested that they can read a little bit more about online. That can be a great resource for people, especially who are grieving.
I really love that you shared that because that's something that was offered to me when I lost my son. And I
Hmm.
had never, I didn't really go to church growing up. My friends made fun of me and called me a C&E Christian, which for the listeners, if you haven't heard that one, just means Christmas and Easter. So I guilty as charged here. But I'll just say that it was really very comforting, honestly, to talk to a chaplain. It really was. Even though
Hmm.
I wasn't very spiritual, I wasn't really on my faith journey much at that point. I'll just say it was a very comforting perspective in that time of grief and loss.
Well, I'm glad to hear that that was a helpful experience in the midst of a lot of suffering. And the other piece I like to specify for individuals, because especially as a chaplain, I am not the church police. Sometimes I'll walk into patients' room, they'll be like, "I've been to church in forever," or "I'm only C&E." I'm like, that's okay. I'm not reporting you to anyone. But sometimes I think it's helpful to look at what religion is and what spirituality is. And so religion might be an agreed upon set of rituals and practices and beliefs held by a community for the sake of communing with the divine. And then spirituality is how do you connect to and explore the world around you, and how do you make meaning and find transcendence? So the spirituality belief is much larger. And for some people, religion helps them in that spirituality. It helps them to connect to the world or to find transcendence or to make meaning. For some people, religion helps some of that definition, and they need to find meaning in other ways as well, or connect to the world in other ways. And for some, religion is not a part of the equation, but they are still fully entrenched in that spirituality definition. And so I invite people to think about what that looks like in their own life, and it is going to be different for everyone.
I think that's what's so powerful about what you do in the hospital realm of things, because, another avenue I've had in my own life experience is when my grandfather, they got in a car accident and he broke all of his ribs on his left side after going through chemo for cancer. This all happened within a 4 weeks period. And long story short, in that hospital environment, you've got families saying, okay, well, we want this direction of care or this thing to happen. And then you've got, um, we did have a chaplain at that point just because the chaplain walks around the hospital. And I love that they walk around. It's never, I was really glad you said I'm not the religion police. I'm really glad you said that because that's the vibe I got off some people. And I was laughing
Mhm.
because the chaplain we had just came by and said, I'm just here to talk. If you want someone to talk
Mhm.
to, it doesn't have to be about the Bible, it doesn't have to be about religion. I'm just here to comfort you in whatever way I can. If you want that, that's fine. If you don't, that's cool too. Um, and so I really do like that it's offering another perspective, another avenue, like you said, for people to walk that journey through the grief they're going through. But I can see how that's a challenging environment for you because you're dealing with there's so many emotions going on. There's so much
Mhm.
medical side of things going on. You also talked to me on when we first met about being there at the end of life for a lot of people and what that process looks like. I'd love to get your perspective on what that's like as a chaplain, being that person that's not related to the family, not involved in those medical decisions, but how do you enter those conversations, and what's support look like from your end when you walk through that?
Yeah, it can look so different in depending on the scenario. So, for instance, as you just shared about your grandfather, part of what we do in my hospital, since we are a level 1 trauma center, is a chaplain automatically responds to any trauma that comes in. So, car accidents, gunshot wounds, falls from a great height. We go not because we're going to do anything medically, but because we're the family support person. Because if you get that call that your loved one's been in an accident, you're going to get to the hospital and your emotions are going to be all over the place. Your anxiety is going to be sky high. You are going to be fearful and wanting to get information as soon as possible. So we meet the family there. Sometimes it's as simple as helping them to sit down or reminding them to breathe. And then we are the liaison with the medical team. So trying to when it's appropriate, when they're not in the middle of doing a huge assessment and all of the medical interventions, pulling out a physician to come and update the family and let them know what's happening. And then if it turns out that they are not able to, revive the patient or the patient does die, we're already embedded in that scenario to help provide that bereavement support. So a lot of times the trauma surgeons will want us in the room when they are sharing the news that the patient has died so that the doctor can leave and go back to all of the other patients they have, but we are there to support that family. So those are maybe more of the crisis deaths that we deal with when people woke up that morning and were not anticipating that their loved one would not be with them at the end of the day. And those are very difficult. We're just kind of thrown into it the same way that the family is thrown into it. But I have navigated that with a lot of people. And so I hear the same themes over and over. So some of what I'm doing is normalizing that for the family going through it. So they say things like, this doesn't feel real. This feels like a bad dream. And so guiding them to say, okay, this is what you'll do next, right? You'll go home, you'll call a funeral home. They'll walk you through this. Here's the number for the medical examiner. So really logistically supporting them because emotionally, they are all over the place. And so sometimes they need a little bit more of that guidance. And then a totally different type of death scenario that we have are when people know that this is occurring. Sometimes the patient themselves, often the family, if we're in the ICU and the patient has not been doing well for a while and they have multiple organs that have been failing them in a terminal disease. We are often involved in the family meetings with the medical team and the family to talk about the fact that their loved one is not getting any better and getting worse. And were it not for these medical interventions and technology, their loved one would not be alive. So then we're looking at doing what's usually called a terminal extubation, or taking their loved one off of life support because that is the only thing sustaining their life in that time. And those deaths can feel very different because it's a weird gift to know that your loved one is about to die. And many people that have been through hospice have experienced this too. And so the family oftentimes will be in the room keeping vigil, with their loved one, and I get to be there as well. And sometimes as an outside presence, I get to be the one to ask, tell me about your loved one. And that's when they're sharing stories, or, I might say, do they have a favorite song that we might play? Of course, if people want to pray, that's a ritual that we can always engage in. But the bulk of what I'm doing in those scenarios is helping people to say goodbye. And there can be a lot of beauty in it. It is so hard, and families are always commenting to me like, "How can you do this? This job is so hard." So it is, but it's also this privilege to get to be with people, usually on the worst day of their lives. And if I can make it just 1% better, that is what I try to do. And even if that 1% is just making sure they know how to get to the elevator as they get back to their car, because time and space can be so overwhelming when we are in the throes of really fresh grief.
I'm really glad you said that because I've had the unfortunate experience to have those things back to back in 5 years. Most recently, 2020 and 2022, I've faced both of that, and I love what you just said about that. There's this weird void that happens when we're in that moment, and it's almost like I've tried to explain it to people. I have a hard time with it, but it's almost like you lose sense of time, you lose sense of
Mhm.
reality. You feel like you're in this weird it'd be like floating in outer space and everything's
Mhm.
so far away from you and there's just
Mhm.
you in that moment. And it's always this place of like, where am I? What am I doing? What just happened? Is this actually real? Am I just dreaming about this? Is this a really just crappy dream? Like I need to slap myself to wake up. Like, and it does take somebody like you to come along. And I'm really grateful for the work that you do because, I never really had somebody like that in my losses. And I did with my child. I had a nurse that did that. I
Mhm.
was very grateful for her, by the way. But yeah, you need somebody there that can be, in a sense, grounded in that moment just to help. And I love that you talked about 1%, because that's another thing I'm really
Mhm.
big about in my coaching practice. And I learned it from James Clear reading Atomic Habits. He said, stop focusing on this 30%, 40% grind mentality of life. Like that just doesn't work. And he said, if you focus on 1% in that moment, and especially in the throes of grief and the moment you just lost somebody or you just watched somebody pass away, that 1% is really all you can really do. And
Mhm.
and like you said, that can be as simple as walking somebody to an elevator or even just saying, this is your next step. That it literally
Mhm.
can be that small, but to the people that go through this, that means the world to them.
Mhm.
It's a big difference for them.
Yeah, because there's nothing that you can do to fix it. There's nothing that you can do to really make it much better. There's plenty that people will do that can make it worse. We can talk about that as well, because
Yeah.
I'm sure you have experience with that. But the other piece that I want to highlight, especially as you were sharing your losses, and my guess is that your listeners know more about those, and you and I have talked about it, but is, in your unique situation, and I think others have found themselves in this situation too, it's a cumulative loss, right? So one time, like one death that we are going through brings up other deaths as well. And people don't always realize that. And sometimes I think people can find that disconcerting. And so I think it's helpful to let people know that is completely normal. It's not pleasant to have to go through. But I'll hear people will tell me, they're like, "Oh, I thought I was, more over this than now." And we say, well, there's never any getting over it. It's getting through it or moving with it. But I think it is shocking to people when it comes up in new and fresh fresh ways as they experience additional griefs in their lives.
I'm really glad you said that because something I haven't shared before on a podcast. So you bring these things out of me when we talk. Because
See that
um,
that's my job.
so when I lost my grandfather, the moment after he passed, and I was not in a good place. I almost
Mm,
passed out from not breathing and all sorts of
mhm,
fun things. And my mind, like you said, my mind was on some other planet. Uh, I faintly remember my mother in that moment because she was there. My grandmother, my mother, and I were there with my grandfather when he went. And long story short, in the midst of all that, I heard my mother say, the same thing just happened to my son that happened to me. I remember her saying
mm,
that. And my mother lost her dad to stage 4 colon cancer back in the 80s. And it's all before medical technology that we have now and processes and whatnot. And I'm glad you said what you just did because I think a lot of people don't really we're never really told how to navigate grief. We're never really told how to work through that. And there's this mindset of like getting over it or letting go.
mhm,
I even got told once, grief is just a part of life. You're just gonna have to learn how to deal with it.
mhm,
And I don't like people hearing those things because
mhm,
it writes off our experience. It writes off our
mhm,
emotions. I share my grief story on my podcast a lot because I try to give people something relatable to say, here's an experience I heard, but here's how my situation is. And I can kind of pull these stories from it. And that's why I have my guests like you on the show too, to kind of compile this package for them to say, like, here's a grief story, here's an expert that deals with this every day. Here's what I can pull away from this. And that is true. You go through grief very differently in life. I talked to somebody last week that said, when I lost this person in my life, I was hit very emotionally deep. It was hard for me to work through that. I then lost somebody else, 3 years later, and I didn't really feel a thing, and I feel weird about that. And I said,
mm,
that's not to be weird.
mhm,
It's that every experience is different, and every experience
mhm.
has its own path.
Yeah, I think that's one of the things that makes it so tricky, right? So the first issue is that we don't talk about grief enough, which is, why we're here. And then the second issue is that it can look different for different people, and you're not going to know until you're in the throes of it. And so much of grief, and especially when we're talking about death and relationship loss, there's different types, other types of grief as well. But as we're talking about this type, is that it is so dependent on the relationship. I'll give you an example. When I first started out in chaplaincy, I was paged to go to someone's room who had just lost his brother. So the patient was in the hospital, and his brother lived a couple states away and had died while the patient was in the hospital. And so, of course, I'm going as my attentive, self, think, oh, tell me about your brother, is how hard this must be for you. And he's like, I haven't talked to my brother in years. He's like, the grief that's harder is that I lost my dog, 2 months ago, and I saw him every day. And that is what is impacting more. So that was a really unique experience and helped me to think about, oh, it's about the relationship. It is about, what we had put into it, that is going to impact us in different ways. Another example is, people who have had loved ones that have terminal conditions, and they've known for a long time that their loved one was going to die, might be surprised that their grief is very different when the person does die, because they've known all along. And so they have had a lot of anticipatory grief going on. And in the hospital, I've seen it where, a patient dies, and then the patient's mother leaves the room, and the staff's like, how can she just leave? I said, well, she's been preparing for this moment for years and years. And so she's done a ton of grief work. So those are just two really extreme examples about how it can take so many different shapes and forms.
I'm really glad you brought up the topic of anticipatory grief because that came up for me a lot the last couple weeks with other guests I've had, and
Mm,
it's something I never really thought about because I kind of did that when my grandfather had terminal cancer, but I was always clinging to this hope that there's more
mhm,
time, there's more.
mhm.
This isn't going to happen as fast as it does, and it happened a lot faster than we thought, and that's the way life works, unfortunately. I
Yeah.
wanted to ask you about that in your experience, when you've seen people go through anticipatory grief, do you see an array of people who've gone through that process and it is still a very hard emotional hit when that happens? Or do you see people that have gone through that process and it's almost like a sense of peace, or it's just a sense of
Mm,
like
mhm.
completion, if that's the right way to phrase
Yeah.
that?
Yeah, it varies. I always say anticipatory grief, it can be a blessing or a burden, and sometimes both in the same time. Especially when I compare it to those crisis traumatic deaths that I see all the time. Like, oh, this actually can be a blessing, to know and to have thought about it, and not just to wake up one day and have your world change. Like you've had a little bit more time to process. I think it does help people to value the time and the relationship that they have while they still have that person. And especially if the patient, or the person who is dying has been in a lot of pain, there can be a lot of relief on the side of the family when the person does die. And I like to share that because that's another thing that takes people off guard and they feel guilty about. They think, oh, I shouldn't be relieved. That's a natural part of it because you saw the suffering, up close and personal, and you don't want your loved one to be in pain. So it really is mixed. I've also been with families that even though the doctors had told them that this was the way that something was heading, there can be a lot of denial. And that can serve a purpose too, to really, prevent someone from confronting what is the reality. So it is rather mixed. And I do think in both scenarios, it's about making sure that you have as much support as possible, in whatever way that might look like, to, talk through it, to process it, to be able to, heal. And with anticipatory grief, there can even be, some healing and some processing done before the death that in other ways that isn't possible. So I have seen, when someone knew that they were going to die, reconciliation happening with maybe estranged family members, or they've been able to, say some things to their loved ones that they just had never been able to say before, or even doing things like advanced care planning. So having the patient fill out forms about a healthcare proxy or instructives for a living will. So when the time comes that they can no longer dictate what they would want for their care, they've already had those conversations with their family, so or whoever they're naming as their proxy to make decisions, so that they're not feeling the added weight of making those decisions, and sometimes guilt on top of their grief.
I think I'm glad you said that, because something you brought up on our initial call was this idea that these moments are, I'm trying to find the right way to phrase
Oh,
this word.
brutal was the term.
Brutal,
Yeah.
brutal. Um,
Both
I,
beautiful and brutal at the same time.
I thought that was such a powerful way to describe loss and describe going through grief, because grief, as I've come to find on the later end of the spectrum, it's a beautiful process. It really is.
Mm,
When you're in the thick of it and it just hits you, it's brutal. I mean,
mhm.
it's a very, I call it the destruction and the rebirth process. And it's
Mm,
because who we are before we lose somebody is not the same person we are after we lose them.
mhm,
And
mhm,
I also thought it was interesting that you talked about how, certain family members will say things that they never really got to say while that person was alive. But also I've seen in grief, it brings out the nasty side in people. I've seen that too happen. And so it's a very interesting process of what happens in the middle of grief, in the middle of loss. And I think that there's a lot of things people don't say when someone's living because they're trying to
mhm,
reconcile and work that out. But then when we're faced with the permanency of loss, that it's the one thing I've learned in my journey. I call it the one thing that is not fixable. There's no takebacks. There's no changing it. It's fixed and permanent. It's never going to change.
mm,
It's that one moment of life that we have to find acceptance, and we oftentimes don't want to, because we as people want to see, we want to be able to fix something. We want to be able to change something. We
mhm,
wish we had said this. We wish we had done that.
mhm,
And so I've seen people go through regret when they go through this process.
mhm. Yeah, you're reminding me that there's a palliative care physician named Ira Byock, who wrote a book. I think it's called Four Things That Matter Most, and he talks about what people need to say when they're dying, or you could say what people need to say to the dying. And they're four very simple phrases, but they carry a lot of weight. So the first is, "Please forgive me." The second is, "I forgive you." The third is, "Thank you." And the fourth is, "I love you." So they're so simple. And of course, people are going to have different variations of those. But to me, at the crux, like that is what matters. And if we can learn to say some of these things to people in our everyday life, then that will prepare us, for when we are at the end of our lives, because we never know, no day is promised. And that's what my work has taught me, is that we never know what's going to happen to us. And really trying to have that front of mind as we are, in relationship with others.
I think that's beautifully said because that's something that it's been forefront of my mind just with all the loss I've gone through that,
Mhm,
our days and time on this planet are not guaranteed. We could
mhm,
end up, I've talked to so many people that have, lost friends to gunshots, lost people to
mhm,
suicide, lost people to a car accident, lost people, to random health conditions that come up or a cancer that's really aggressive. We just don't, I think like grief is really a big lesson I've learned is that life here isn't permanent. It can be
mhm,
taken away very fast, and it's up to us how we want to make things happen in our life. And I think the four things you just shared, by the way, about forgiveness, about saying thank you and I love you, those are very powerful phrases that carry a lot of weight. And a lot of times we don't
mhm.
always reflect on them a lot until it's that very last moment of things.
Mhm.
Um,
And I'll say this too, because your listeners may be, dealing with grief and over losing someone where they didn't get to say any of these things to. And I like to point out it's not too late, right? You can still say these things even if you didn't have the opportunity to say this to someone, while they were living. And it's more about your interior process of how do you um, how do you state these things aloud for yourself? You can always rewrite what did you wish that you would have said if you do have regret. And that's something else I see, um, families with lots of regret, particularly in the hospital. Um, Again, this is something I'd like to let people know because it's so normal, but people feel a lot of guilt when it happens to them. Is a lot of times I see patients die by themselves, and it's maybe as soon as their loved one went to the cafeteria to get a cup of coffee, went home to shower. And I like to think of it as, that was that patient's like last sense of control. And maybe they didn't want anyone there, when they died, and they wanted to, maybe spare their loved ones. But what I inevitably hear from the family is, "Oh, I feel so guilty, about this. I shouldn't have left." But it is a phenomenon that we see all the time. And so, just in case your listeners have experienced that, to say that is rather normal.
I'm glad you brought that up because that's something that you reminded me of a piece of advice I got in the middle of my grief, and I did not take it well when I first heard this because I was in the middle of my emotional issues. That I'll just say that um, my coach at one point when I was having a really bad day with my grief said, when your grandfather died, that was his experience. That was his loss.
Hmm.
It wasn't yours. And
Hmm.
I got really angry when I heard that. And now looking back, I understand it. That was their experience. These people that pass on to this next world of life, that's their process. That's their experience. The suffering and pain we feel is because we're being a part of that experience, but it's not ours. And so
Hmm.
a lot of our suffering is our own cause, our own doing.
Hmm.
And I'm just for my listeners, I want you guys to know if you're upset that I just said that, I was right there. I was right there with you. I just want to share
Hmm.
that.
Hmm.
That takes a while to get there, but it taught me a lot about kind of what Christine and I are talking about today. That understand that that's their experience and our suffering is our own making in that moment gives us back control of ourself and gives us the ability to be okay with how we want to handle grief. If you have to yell or get those thoughts and emotions out, whatever way that comes, it's okay. There's no rule
Mm,
book for this. It's okay.
mhm,
If you want to write a letter, if you want to talk to a chaplain, talk to somebody different, you just, I've seen people go to a graveside, by the way, and talk to a headstone. And
mhm,
like I still remember my grandmother doing that too, by the way. She went up because we found out her mom had a child and didn't tell her that the whole time. And she didn't find that out till she was 65, 67. And she went up to her mother's headstone and said, "You were a naughty lady, mother." Like, and so that kind of grief comes out that way. Um,
mhm,
so I think it's important. I want to share that because you jogged my memory with that, but I wanted to share that for the reason that it's okay to grieve the way you want to grieve and say what you need to
mhm,
say. It's completely
mhm,
okay.
mhm. Yeah, and you also referenced in that like the bodily experience, right? Like the sometimes it does require the yelling, or even as you shared about being with your grandfather that you felt like you were going to pass out. Grief can be this physical experience that I think we also don't talk about the ways in which, we live it in our body. There's a lot of research, and people are now talking a lot more about trauma and how trauma resides in our body. So too, grief is a physical experience. And so, putting that out there, if you're actively grieving, think about how you might engage in some embodiment practices to help in some of your healing. I recently did grief yoga for the first time. I'd never done this before, and met someone who was a practitioner of it. I was like, oh my, and I've been working with grief for years and years and years. And this was a new thing for me. I'm like, oh my goodness, it totally opened up my eyes to the ways in which I was still holding on to different pieces of grief and thought I had processed them fully. But lo and behold, they were still coming out in new and different ways for me.
So this is the first time I've heard about grief yoga. What is that a little different from a normal yoga
It
session
is.
or
I'll give you her contact information because she does podcasts too. So if you're looking for more guests, she would be a great one.
there we
Because she could speak to it a lot more than I can. She's the practitioner. I was just along for the ride in one of her classes.
I just think that's a cool experience because
Hmm.
I'm like you said, there's a lot of people now talking about trauma, and I did hypnosis yesterday with a guest on my
Oh.
show. First time
Oh.
I've done that. It is definitely not like the movies. I'm gonna tell my listeners it is not like Office Space. You don't just sit there all super happy and everything. It's a very different process. And that's why I was
Mm,
asking about the yoga too, because there's different modalities. That's what
yes.
I share with people about grief. I always say there's
Hmm.
not one said way to do things. There's
No.
no rule book for this.
Hmm.
Grief is all about, if you're into meditation, I personally struggle with it, but if meditation works for you, do it. If grief yoga
Hmm.
works for you, do it.
Hmm.
Um,
Yeah, you can pull from so many different options, and something might work for you in one season and then maybe not in another. But you're right, see what is out there. For some people, individual therapy works well. For others, they want to be in a group. For some people, medication is a helpful support. For others, they may go to acupuncture. Some like spiritual direction. Some like to stay far away from anything that has to do with anything spiritual. So really giving yourself permission to figure out what it is that might be helpful for you and not to be afraid of trying some things because sometimes it pushes us to get out of our comfort zones when we're looking to really be in a certain emotion in a new way.
so something I wanted to ask you, since you're a chaplain and you're in the hospital and you see loss on a scale most of us barely touch in our life. And the reason I say that, we might lose a few people in our life, but you're in it day to day. Um, what is it like for you in your own personal world of grief? Because, and the reason I ask this is when I talked to some nurses at a lost parent event that I went to, these nurses that were there when my son was born openly told us, and they don't show this in the hospital, by the way, but they said, "We grieve your loss just like you."
Mm,
And
mhm,
it is also very sad for us. We have to put on that professional face to help you through these things in that moment, but we do go home and grieve. We do go home and have
mhm,
our own set of loss and grief with these experiences. I wanted to ask you as a chaplain, how is grief for yourself? How has that impacted you being in that space? And do you have practices and things you do to navigate that grief
mhm,
so that you're able to be able to be yourself, but also be fully there for people in that capacity.
Mhm. Yeah, so I think the similar way that you talk about doing this podcast as a way of making meaning of your own grief, right? And having a legacy of your own losses. That is a lot of what brought me into this work, right? Is having gone through things and recognizing, oh, I can use my experiences to help others. Um, and so it's a big motivation. And a lot of what we do in our chaplaincy education is look at our own emotions, excuse me, our own life story and how we might tap into some of that to know how to care for others better. So there is a lot of psychodynamic elements to the work. And then another piece of it is that, self-care. As you mentioned with the nurses, there's an element of sometimes people call it vicarious trauma or second person trauma. So as I'm with a family, they're saying goodbye. Of course, I'm going to feel that. Sometimes I may feel it more different, more intently than others, depending on the situation. If they remind me of someone in my family, or if it's a loss similar to one that I've had, or even if same name as someone I know, there could be all different reasons, or maybe it's just a hard day for me to begin with, and then that really enacts it even more. So I've learned to do several different things over the years, and now instruct my students to do some of the same. One is, how am I going to honor that death that I just witnessed?
Mm.
I like to write, and so I write a lot of stories of loss, not to be voyeuristic, but sometimes it helps me to process it. And because I get to be the holder of these sacred stories that, as we said, can be brutal. And I don't want to be the only one to hold it, right? Because I think others can benefit. So a lot of what I do in my writing is share some of these stories. Now, I de-identify it a lot. So, there's no HIPAA violations, and I like to think that there's no privacy violations. I change a lot of the details so that it's not recognizable. But I think that helps me. Sometimes some of my students or other chaplains, every time they're at a death, they will, plant something as an honoring. Others will, go to the church and say a prayer for that person, but really having some sort of ritual to acknowledge, I was there, I saw this, I bore witness, and, this is how I'm going to continue to bear witness. The other piece is just general self-care that I think most of us struggle with if we are, in helping professions. So making sure that I have my own therapist, I have my own spiritual director, I have my own peer group of other chaplains that I meet with, and we talk about our work. We joked before, I live on a farm because it it is so different, to go from a hospital in a city environment to, running around and building fences and weeding gardens. And for me, getting back in touch with my spirituality is important. And so a lot of that is through being in nature and being in connection with the land. I do meditate. And so that's
I
a
love
difference that we
that.
have, but that's something it took me a while to figure out how to do for myself in a way that was meaningful. So that's something I turned to. And then physicality. We talked a little bit before about embodiment, like making sure that I am moving in meaningful ways and taking care of my physical health, knowing how my emotional health can sometimes impact my physical health.
I think that's really big that you just said that. And by the way, for our listeners that are just heard Christine talk about going from the city life to the outside life, I will share she does have chickens, and I'm very jealous because I lived in a rural area for 7 years, and we would have chickens crossing the road constant, and they would always be jumping a fence or jumping in a pond or whatever it was. They're wild little creatures. Um, but I love that you described the duality of that. That's what I love,
Mm,
is that when you live in the city, it's a very high fast, high paced, very different environment. Then you go into a rural setting, and it's a very much slow pace of life, but more connected to nature, and more connected to grounding in the earth, if you will. I'm big into that side of spirituality of things,
mm,
reconnecting with our environment. Um,
mm.
And I think that's a really unique way to handle grief, by the way. I tell people in coaching when they feel stuck or they feel like they're really locked into something, I say change your environment radically. I mean,
Hmm.
if you're a big city person and you're stuck, go to the mountains. I'm not kidding. Go out in the
Hmm.
middle of the woods on some Forest Service road. Your mind will slow down. Your mind will calm down.
Hmm.
And the crazy
Hmm.
part is the turbo racer up here is now slow. And all of a sudden you'll start getting all these messages out of yourself. And it won't come in a harsh way. It'll come in a very calm way. It'll come from a place of compassion and understanding and really feeling how you feel for yourself. It's why I go to the mountains all the time and why I go out on my boat all the time. I change my environment constantly.
Hmm.
And that way it allows your energy to flow. Because something like you
Hmm.
said earlier too about meditation too. It's a thing that I really struggle with because I have ADHD, so it's really hard for me to sit still that very long to do that. But talk to people who practice meditation a lot and do it frequently. And I will say it's something very powerful. If you can do it, do it. It actually is very, very helpful to calm your mind, calm your nervous system, and you can hear those messages come through that you need to hear.
And there's so many different types of meditation as well. So you might be better at like a walking or a moving meditation, right? So sitting silently in a room may not be the best thing. Or others tell me they really don't like silence. And so doing guided meditation, listening to someone kind of prompt them through what they're supposed to be doing is helpful. So yeah, there's so many different types as well.
Another thing I want to talk about on the podcast today, because this is something that has come up on virtually most of my episodes, and even most people I talk to, is what do we say to grievers? That's the
Mm.
big thing that comes up. And as I've shared a lot on podcast episodes, my listeners hear me say this all the time because I ask different people, different guests on my show these questions. We always get told grief is this like, it's a thing that happens in life and you just got to figure it out. Or we say you got to let it go, you got to move on. People push grief under the rug. I wanted to get your take as a chaplain about what are some key things you could say to somebody who is either anticipatory grief or they're going through grief and loss. What are some of the most, appropriate and effective things to say to them? Things that can be acknowledging to that person going through that experience.
Mhm. Well, first, I'm going to tell you what not to say. I know you know this already, but I'm going to say it for your listeners because we have some of these phrases that are kind of religious-y in nature and have become part of our conversational lexicon that are really toxic. And I wrote a whole article about this. So if you need a refresher, I can send it to you. You can put it in the show notes. But there's a lot of religious platitudes that well-meaning people say that do more harm spiritually than good. So please don't say things like everything happens for a reason, God needed another angel, let go and let God. God won't give you more than you can handle. There's all sorts of reasons to not say those things. But one of the main reasons is that they silence what the other person is going through and their experience. And it's more about the person saying them trying to cheer it up and fix the problem of grief. When really the best thing to do, I think, is to show up and shut up. Your presence can make a difference. A lot of times, my chaplain interns will tell me when they come back from a bedside death, they're shocked that the family gave them a hug afterward and thanked them for all they did. And they say to me, Christine, I didn't really do anything. I just stood there. I said, that's all the things you bore witness to what they were going through. You didn't give them this toxic theology of trying to cheer them up. You were there and allowed them to feel what they were feeling. So our words can really get in the way, but our presence can speak volumes. Now, it may be awkward to hang out with someone for an hour and not say anything. So if you need a few words, I will give you some. What I think is helpful is letting the griever take the lead. So sometimes I will say to people I know that are grieving that I'm not working with a professional manner, I'll say, you want to go for a walk and we can talk about whatever you want to talk about. And sometimes that is their grief for their person that they lost, and sometimes it's not. But saying, I am available to do this. I hear from a lot of people that don't want to ask the griever how they're doing, or they don't want to remind them of their pain. I say, no, there's no reminding. They're in it all the time. And oftentimes will welcome the opportunity to get to talk about their loved one, because society has kind of moved on and doesn't allow for them to have those conversations. So that's one. And even if you need something simple to say, like, I have no words to make it better, is better than offering those empty platitudes. Or to say, how are you really feeling? And maybe not asking that when you see them in the grocery store, because that's not the time or place. But to really inquire, and then to be with them as they talk about those feelings that might be coming up for them, and not try to fix it, just really holding that space. So those are just a few examples, and then just acknowledge how terrible it is. Acknowledge the situation. I also recommend to people who want to support their loved ones and their friends who are grieving to, reach out beyond just the initial death. You may have had this experience where there is a rush of, support if there's a funeral, if there's, the common rituals that we do. But then 3 or 6 months later, like I said, everyone else has kind of moved on, and you're still grappling with this loss. And so to be a touch point, to reach out to your friends in those settings too.
I'm really glad you said those things today, because the one that you just brought up too is that I have experienced that, and that was one that was really hard when I lost my son. Is everybody showed up that first month, and then shoof, it was gone,
Mm-hmm.
and something like a lot of people don't know. This is kind of a lost community thing with parents, though, is that we never move on from it. We just don't.
Mm-hmm.
It's
Yep.
always there, and so we do though get very scared and very nervous, because we grapple with that till the day we die, and that's the really
Mm-hmm.
hard part that one of my guests talked about last week. She lost her father to mesothelioma, and I remember her saying somebody told her like 6 months after it happened, like, aren't you like, I know this happened to you, like, aren't you like kind of over it? Like it happened. And I
Mm-hmm.
sat there with her and I was like,
Mm-mm.
like not the right thing to say to somebody. Um,
Mm-hmm.
and so
Mm-hmm.
I think what's important, what you just shared, is very valuable for my listeners, is that don't be the parade that shows up at that the 1 month and then just takes off and doesn't really check in. Be that person that the big thing you highlighted today that I love, it's spinning in my head right now, so I'm having a hard time putting my words together, is holding space for people.
Mm-hmm.
Sometimes I get on a coaching call with a client and they're all over the place. They've had a lot of stuff happen that week. And yes, and my natural thing is, yes, I can help you fix that. Yes, I can help you get through
Mm-hmm.
that. But my first question I get to is, how can I support you today? Is where I
Mm-hmm.
start, is where can I support you? Um,
Mm-hmm.
and that's holding space for somebody. That's letting,
Yeah.
like you said, letting the griever guide that path.
Mm-hmm.
And there's times, I was glad you brought this up too. There's times I talk to coaching clients and we'll talk about the weather. We'll talk about something that happened that week that's not even related to coaching, but we go there, and that's okay, by
Mm-hmm.
the way, because it's part of the process. And when we give grievers that space to just be, you'll
Mm-hmm.
find a lot with grievers that sometimes grief it's a roller coaster. Sometimes it's very calm, it's very quiet, kind of like the
Mm-hmm.
lake behind me on my screen.
Mm-hmm.
Other times it's a huge monstrous ocean that's roaring with
Mm-hmm.
huge waves that are just pounding and crashing from every angle. And it can feel like you're suffocating. And so holding that space for somebody is very, very big. And I love how you said too that one of your fellow chaplains said, like, I didn't do anything. I just stood here. You have no idea
Mm-hmm.
when somebody's in that grief
Mm-hmm.
space and their mind is all over the place.
Yeah.
Just your presence, I can tell
Mm-hmm.
people, as I've been there, just the presence of yourself, that is a big, big gift for somebody in
Mm-hmm.
that process. Because what you're really doing on top of just being there and not even saying anything, you're giving somebody grounding that they don't have. You're giving them that. You're giving them the kind of, I said it when my grandfather died. The reason it was so painful is my grandfather's a rock for me in my life. He's the one guy,
Mm-hmm.
one man I could count on. And when he was gone, I
Mm-hmm.
said, shoot, that's gone. Like, what do I do?
Mhm.
I had to become my own rock. And so
Mhm.
I always say that if you are in that place and you have a chaplain in the room, they don't always have to say something, and they probably won't sometimes. They're going to let you guide that process. But
Mhm.
just know that silence doesn't mean they're not there. Silence is them
Mhm.
giving you space. And that's the big
Mhm.
thing that is such a beautiful gift.
Yeah, I think my friends in the Jewish tradition get it right because when you sit Shiva, which is the 7 day period after the um, kind of morning rituals, uh, you are supposed to, everyone that's coming to someone's house who is grieving, they are supposed to wait until the grieving folks talk first. So none of the people coming to support them are supposed to talk until the bereaved speak. And so to me, that says something like we're going to honor the silence and then we're going to let you take the lead and what is it that you need versus us accidentally putting things on you that, are not going to be helpful.
That's a part of Shiva I did not know. So I
Mhm.
appreciate you sharing that. I think that's such a powerful thing. And the other thing too I wanted to build on off of what we talked about today, is this is a powerful lesson I learned recently with one of my podcast guests, is that people can empathize to the level of their experiences of life. And
Mhm.
something that I want to, kind of wrap up our episode with is, talking about safe people to talk to and people not safe to talk
Mm,
to, because I
mhm,
think that as grievers, and I made these mistakes in my own grief process, is why I bring them up on my show so somebody doesn't do what I did. um, your natural intent is to want to open up to people and
mm,
share your story, share your experience. And I will say that as a griever, you're in a very vulnerable place emotionally,
mhm,
mentally, physically. And our natural call as humans is to open up. But there's going to be people that say inappropriate things. There's going to be people that say insensitive things, and it's going to re-stimulate trauma. It's going to re-stimulate those
mhm,
negative things that come out of you, and it's because you're in an emotionally vulnerable place. So it's really not to be blamed of any kind, but it's just where you're at in that process. I wanted to get your thoughts on that discussion about how to find safe people, or what safe people look like in that grief process.
mm. Yeah, there's a beautiful quote, I'm pretty sure it's anonymous, of the cry of the soul can only be heard by one whose soul has already cried. And I love that because I think the people whose soul have already cried are the safe people a lot of times. They are the ones that aren't going to tell you to get over it because they know what it is to sit in the depths of despair and the depths of pain. When I am interviewing chaplaincy students, one of my first questions is, okay, I want to hear about the worst part of your life. Tell me about, the tragedy, because that to me is what equips them to sit with other people much more than any fancy theological degree, although they have to have those too. And so I would say if you are in the midst of grieving, to really look for who are the people that you can trust who maybe have been through something similar, or even if it's something different, they just know the bitter of the world. And there can be sweetness as well, but they may not be the folks that you're going to want to open up and share all of your innermost thoughts with. Certainly, there are a lot of professionals that can help you through this, such as, yourself, any sort of grief coaching. We talked about spiritual direction earlier. Therapists that are really, grief informed, so many online support groups or in-person support groups. And what I love about some of the support groups is it is a community of people. And so even if you don't connect with one person in there may be someone else that you can connect with. And a lot of times they can be around specific types of loss, so it can be around perinatal or stillbirth loss. It can be around spouse loss. It can be around childhood loss. And I think those can be helpful as well to kind of find a place where you feel like you can share openly without fear of judgment.
I love that she said that, because that's really a big part of the grief process I wish I had been mindful of early on. Because when you do find those people that are safe, when those people that hold space, as you said, those people that won't always say things, but they'll give that opportunity for you to just to talk and really guide, let the griever guide. I feel like the people that do that, they will help you heal the quickest. And I'm not
Mm,
saying that you're ever going to, I don't like the term fully healed. I'm just not a fan of
right.
that.
Yeah.
I don't like that. I think healing is a very lifelong journey,
Yep.
that
Absolutely.
changes and evolves with who you become. So that's my view on that. But I'll just say that I think finding those safe people helps you get in that place a little easier and a little quicker for you so that you can discover what that process looks like for you.
And it can be hard to get into because sometimes our tendency is wanting to go inward, right? And kind of shutting off. Whereas that is something that we may need to fight against our natural proclivities a little bit.
Yeah, and I think that's what's hard for people that go through grief. You know, there are times that we go through severe trauma. I've met a lot of people lately who've gone through. I don't like to compare traumas and losses, but I'll just say they've been
Mhm.
through very harsh experiences I've never experienced in my life, and I find my body doing that urge of like, whoa, that's hard to share. Like, and I see people have the bravery to do that.
Mm,
And I think that our natural reaction sometimes is to want to hold that in and keep that in ourselves and not want to either share or open up. And that can be a fear of getting hurt again. That can be a fear of reliving it again. But when we do find those safe people that give us that space, um,
mm,
we start to open up just a little bit. And
mhm,
again, it's back to what you said earlier. That opening up thing, I tell people at 1%, just like you mentioned on the
mm,
podcast,
mhm.
1%. And just give yourself the ability to know that, you know, grief is not a linear process. It's
No.
not going to be
Mm-mm.
this flat line, easy thing. It's going to be a whole lot of this all the time.
Mhm.
Um, and when you accept that about that process, you'll find those windows within those waves where you can open up. And it'll get a little bit easier over time, just a little bit. In that process. I wanted to ask you as we end the show, I always ask my guests two different questions at the very end of the show. If you run across somebody who is just now experiencing grief, or somebody who is going through grief and is stuck, what are one or two things that you would share with them to help them navigate that healing journey?
Mm. That's a great question. I've written a lot of articles, so that might be helpful to them, especially around different types of losses or how to support other people. They can certainly take a look. I'm on Substack and I have some articles there that may be helpful. Um, And I think the other thing that I would share with them is similar to what you just said, that it isn't linear. And even Elizabeth Kubler-Ross, who wrote the whole stages later in her life, said, I didn't mean for these stages to be linear. You all kind of took this and ran with it, but it can be so many of those things at so many different times. And so I would encourage people to be gentle and gracious with themselves. The world is going to want you to move on. When there is no moving on, there's only moving through, and to allow yourself to do that, and to surround yourself with people who will support you.
That's beautifully said. I love that. I also, for my listeners today, if you enjoyed talking to Christine, I'm going to ask her, where can we find you?
Mhm. So probably my website is the best starting point. It is my first name, Christine, and then V as in Victor, and then my last name, Davies, Davies.com. And on there, you have all my social media links as well as a link to my Substack newsletter. And then if you're looking to work with someone as a spiritual director, I do have some space for individual supervision, and I have supervision and spiritual direction. And I have some links a little bit more about what that is on my website as well.
That's really awesome. Well, Christine, I just want to thank you so much for being a guest on the podcast today. I feel like you gave a lot of very transformational information and a very awesome perspective on how to navigate this grief journey and what this looks like, and some very key pieces to be mindful of as you move forward in the grief journey. So I just want to say thank you.
Oh, thank you. I'm so honored to have been invited and glad that you're putting this content out there for your listeners.
Well, I want to thank all of our guests for joining Christine and I on this episode of the Empower Grief Journey. If this episode resonated with you guys, please share it with somebody that you know could benefit from Christine's story. The Empower Grief Journey is all about honoring your journey, embracing your emotions, and finding strength in your own time. I want to invite you to follow our podcast at empowergriefjourney.com. I want you guys to know you're never alone in this journey, and together we can navigate grief with courage and compassion. Until next time, be kind to yourself and take your grief journey one step at a time.